On this edition of Independent Sources, landmark victory or political theater. Will a recent New York City Council bill potentially overturn a controversial immigration policy?
Cleanup crew. Local environmentalists make plans for Greenpoint, Brooklyn after a big win against a giant oil company.
And leveling the playing field. Minority filmmakers find new outlets for serialized shows.
Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Gary Pierre-Pierre.
And I'm Vianora Vinca. New York City Council recently passed a bill that bars the police department from turning in illegal immigrants charged with low-level crimes to federal authorities. The bill potentially overturns part of the controversial Secure Communities program that requires the NYPD to report all arrests of illegal immigrants, no matter what the level of crime.
Immigration advocates are hailing this bill as a landmark victory. But will it hold up to federal pressure that may come to bear as the government continues to push for stricter immigration enforcement? I sat down with Lindsay Nash, a lawyer at the Cardozo Immigration Justice Clinic, which is part of the Cardozo School of Law. We spoke about the ruling's potential to set a legal precedent. Before we start, I wanted to let our viewers know that we tried several times to get someone from the ICE to come on the show to discuss this issue. Unfortunately, they never responded. Lindsay, talk to us about the significance of this law now that New York City police officers and other law enforcement officials don't have to turn over a criminal who have committed a misdemeanor to the federal agents.
Well, this law is important because it applies to the New York police like it applies to New York City jails. And basically what it says is we recognize that there's many instances where it's not in the city's interest to detain certain people for federal immigration enforcement. And it has impacts not only on the people who the federal government is trying to detain and deport, but also to their families who stand to lose breadwinners and caretakers and wage earners.
But now let's make the distinction. We're not talking about, let's say, somebody who's been arrested for rape or armed robbery or even murder. We're talking about misdemeanors, small, in some cases, petty crimes, right?
Yes, I mean, this bill says basically that if you have charges pending for a relatively low-level
Give us an
crime,
example of what we're talking about, relatively low-level crime.
Something like turnstile jumping.
Mm-hmm.
Now, New York has said, no, we're not going to. If they don't have any other convictions and they just have a charge that's pending for that, New York is not going to hold that person for immigration enforcement to come and pick them up. That's just not what we want to focus our resources on.
And so the importance of it to you is that it keeps families together who otherwise would be torn apart.
Exactly. It keeps families together. It keeps people from being afraid of police. I mean, they can call the police and report a crime if they see it without being afraid that the police are going to deport the person. So it has significant impact for New York as a whole, not just for the immigrants who are at risk of being deported.
You know, when I read about this, immediately what comes to mind is that the New York City Council is often accused of overreaching its boundaries, acting as it is part of Congress, or it is Congress, a little bit of a Congress of its own. Is it overreaching in this case?
Is it overreaching? No. I mean, this is something that New York has been a leader on, but other localities around the country have also enacted detainer discretion type policies. And it's had significant impacts both for New York and around the nation. So this is a significant step for New York City to take, and this is an appropriate step. Okay.
Now, one of the few city council members who voted against this bill, Dan Holloran of Queens, his quote in one of the articles was that, well, if people cannot abide by a law, they shouldn't be in this country or in the city. How do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that doesn't necessarily take into account what's going on here. A lot of the people that are swept up into the federal immigration enforcement, despite the fact that the federal government has said that it's focusing on dangerous criminal immigrants, what's actually happening is a lot of the people that are swept up into that have no convictions, may not even have any pending charges. Most of the people are prosecuted for civil immigration violations, which are simply technical violations of the immigration and nationality laws. And it just doesn't benefit New York to hold these people.
Is New York the first city or the only city that has such a law?
No, no. New York has been a leader in this respect, but there's other localities, other towns and cities throughout the nation that have similar versions of this type of law. New York was one of the first cities to enact such a law, but it's had positive effects around the country and even on the federal government's policy of late.
Do you expect pushback from ICE on this issue?
We don't expect any backlash. The New York law has been on the books for years, and there's not been any cuts to spending, there's been no litigation, nor has there been in any city that we know of around the nation. So we don't expect any backlash, and actually, ICE, the number of detainers dropped last year precipitously.
Okay.
The number of times that the number of instances in which the federal government requested that New York hold a person for them dropped precipitously last year.
That's a very good point, because if the person is not wanted for anything and there's no record anywhere for ICE to know that this person is being detained, so how does that work? Because you just raised an interesting point.
Well, that's really the problem that's been on people's minds recently, and that's the problem that's motivated this legislation in large part, because the federal government has changed its enforcement tactics. And so basically it tapped into local law enforcement at the earliest stage. As soon as the police run a person's fingerprints, that gets sent to ICE and triggers this process where ICE asks them to hold the person. But New York has tried to resist that. It said, you know, we don't want any part of this. This is not in our interest. And the federal government activated it in New York over New York's objection. So the federal government has asserted itself into the law enforcement process here in New York, and this legislation is a means by which New York is saying, we're not going to be brought into this. We're not having this foisted upon us. We're going to look at it with a little bit of a discerning eye and figure out times that we think that we should be holding a person, and there's many instances where we don't think we should be holding the person.
I'm curious as to why did the Cardozo Immigration Justice Clinic get behind this issue, this particular issue?
Well, this issue is something that people have been advocating around in New York for years. In 2009, an organization called Make the Road New York came to us with a problem that many of its members were confronting, and that was the problem of its members being held in by New York City jails and handed over to immigration authorities. And they said, you know, what can we do about this? And so it was really from that this idea of detainer discretion was born, which is to say that localities have looked at these requests from ICE to hold people and said, no, it's actually up to us. We have some ability to make a decision in this field. And
so how were you able to help that organization?
Well, we represented that organization in advocating for and eventually passing the ICE out of Rikers law, which is the predecessor law to the current legislation. And basically it says, if this person has no criminal convictions and they're not facing any pending charges, we're not going to hold this person, which seems like a pretty obvious thing, but that was what we were seeing happening. People who didn't have any criminal convictions, who had no pending charges, were still being handed over to ICE. So the first law enacted by the City Council, which Speaker Quinn and Councilmember Mark Viverito and Councilmember Drum really got behind, that's what paved the way for this most recent legislation.
All right, thank you very much, Lindsay.
Thanks.
Still to come on the show, what to do with a multi-million-dollar settlement after a major oil spill in Brooklyn.
Before that, Abby Shola has some other news.
Thanks, Vianora. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic and community media. A group of nonconformist Hasidic Jews have started a new movement out of a Crown Heights apartment. The Forward reports that the group is open to gays, women, and vegans, all groups normally shunned by ultra-Orthodox Jews. The group meets in Shmuley Toran's Crown Heights apartment, where they party and escape the community's strict social norms. Toran is openly gay, but still wanted to keep practicing Judaism. From El Diario La Prensa, thousands of New York City residents have left their homes uptown due to a lack of affordable housing in the area. Neighborhoods such as Washington Heights, Inwood, and Marble Hill have lost thousands of rent-controlled apartments over the course of the past 10 years. As a result, more than 18,000 people have had to relocate within the decade. Illegal evictions and a lack of new construction of affordable housing have also led to the change. Local politicians have spoken out about the issue. City Council member Yadanis Rodriguez says the city has mismanaged the distribution of finances in Upper Manhattan. She suggests the city look into approving rezoning some of the available space in order to build new housing. Immigration activists are breathing a sigh of relief after the Obama administration announced hundreds of immigrants will be released from federal detention to save government money. Color Lines reports that immigration rights activists have long demanded that the government release detainees from the system that they say was expensive and unfair. However, critics say that releasing detainees is more of a political stunt to get Republicans to cooperate with the decision regarding the sequester deal rather than a step in the right direction. Ethnic and community media outlets have long complained that local government agencies overlook them when choosing to run ads about programs and services. So the Center for Community and Ethnic Media interviewed city officials, advertising executives, and newspaper publishers to find out why. According to Voices of New York, the organization found that although the combined circulation of community and ethnic publications is equal to over half the city's population, they receive about 18% of the city's ad budget. Also, the majority of the ad budget of city agencies is earmarked for mainstream publications, such as the New York Times, the Post, and the Daily News. The rest is dispersed among smaller community and ethnic publications. And finally, Greenpoint, Brooklyn has the highest number of public drinking complaints in New York City. Brooklyn Inc. spoke to members of the community who say that drinkers are causing disturbances in the neighborhood throughout the day. Other residents who've been living in the area for years say this has always been a neighborhood problem. Those were just some stories making headlines this week. Back to Gary and Vianora.
Thanks, Abby. In this next segment, we're going to revisit a story we brought to you about 2 years ago. Back then, local environmentalists were fighting for ExxonMobil to clean up and pay for the environmental damage caused by their huge oil spills along Newtown Creek in Greenpoint, Brooklyn.
Since we ran the story, ExxonMobil has agreed to pay $25 million and committed to cleaning up the area that borders Queens and Brooklyn. The effort now is to get the community to decide on what to do with the money from this watershed victory.
I spoke with Philip Musegas of the environmental group Riverkeeper about the significance of the victory and plans for the $1 million settlement and cleanup. Philip, before we discuss the settlement, give the audience a sense of the magnitude of the environmental disaster in Brooklyn that we're talking about.
Sure. Well, the area that's affected by this oil spill is about 175 acres, 56 acres of it, and this is all under North Brooklyn in the Greenpoint neighborhood of Brooklyn. There's an oil plume under this entire area. It's the site of an old Exxon refinery that operated from the late 1800s to the early, about mid-1960s, roughly. And during that time, this refinery and these other sites nearby spilled and dumped about 17 to 30 million gallons of oil into the environment. So a lot of that oil just soaked into the ground and contaminated the groundwater, and a large amount of it also flowed over time into Newtown Creek, which borders this site. And so it's a very, very large oil spill. Up until the BP Gulf oil spill of a couple of years ago, this Greenpoint spill was the largest oil spill in American history, several times larger than the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska. So it's a very large area. It's unique in some not so good ways because it's in a very densely populated urban area. And so it was left kind of neglected and unaddressed for a long time. And since 2010, we've had a good settlement in place, and we're starting to finally clean it up.
How has the news of the $25 million settlement been received by your organization as well as environmental activists?
It was received well. I mean, Riverkeeper was involved to a certain degree in working out the settlement with ExxonMobil and with the state of New York, and so we were pleased with the terms. You know, we think that having a $20 million settlement that specifically goes to the community, to the Greenpoint community, to fund environmental benefit projects is a good settlement. And keep in mind that Exxon is also on the hook essentially for cleaning up the oil spill, and there's no cost cap on that. This $25 million, which actually is divided up between the environmental benefits for the community and some penalties and some money that went back to the state for the cost that the state had of the cleanup. But $19.5 million goes directly to the community. So that, you know, we think that's a good amount of money. We think it's a good way for the community to actually, whether they want to expand parks or build an environmental education center or increase public access to Newtown Creek, which a lot of people in the community are interested in, it gives them a fund that they can use, and they have almost sole discretion on how they're allowed to use that money, and so it's a good development.
What about the cleanup, though? You said that there's no cap on the cost, and EPA has estimated that it could cost up to $1 billion. What does this $25 million mean in the grand scheme of things and this cost? Well,
it's there are a couple of different things going on. The ExxonMobil oil spill cleanup that Exxon is liable for actually addresses the oil that's under the land, under the Greenpoint neighborhood. Then the oil that's gone into Newtown Creek will be addressed by Exxon and by other parties under the Superfund law that the EPA is administering. And so
explain the Superfund.
Sure. So Superfund is it's an environmental federal law that addresses areas that have historic levels of contamination and very high levels of toxic contamination, either from hazardous chemicals or oil or a combination of these things. And so EPA comes in and they will designate an area as a Superfund site if it's a very large, complicated cleanup that basically that the state can't handle, or that has a number of different parties that are liable for the cleanup. So the EPA came in 2010 and decided to make the entire Newtown Creek a Superfund site. So this includes not only the oil spill that Exxon caused that went into the creek, but also other refineries along the creek that spilled oil into it. There are old copper smelting companies and chemical companies along the creek that caused a lot of pollution. So, and we're talking about 150 years of pollution of the creek. So that cleanup process, which the planning for that is just now underway. They haven't started cleaning up the creek yet, but that could cost close to $1 billion, and that will take probably at least 10 to 15 years. So that's kind of separate from what Exxon has been doing since 2010 to clean up the oil spill.
This $25 million settlement happened a few years ago. What has been accomplished since then?
Well, the main thing on the cleanup side, Exxon has expanded the number of groundwater wells that it's put into the site. So essentially, in order to clean up an oil spill that you have under a land area, the oil is basically floating in the top of the groundwater that's under the ground. So Exxon puts in wells that they actually use to pump out the combined groundwater and oil. They separate the oil from the groundwater, and then they treat the water and discharge it back into the environment, and they dispose of the oil. So that's been going on. They've expanded their rate of cleanup of that since 2010. I believe since they've started cleaning this up back in the early 90s, Exxon has removed approximately around 8 million gallons of oil from the environment. They still have a long way to go. We're not sure how much oil was actually spilled in total. We think it's anywhere between 17 and 30 million gallons. And so, you know, depending on what the total amount out there is, we could still have another 10 to 15 years of cleanup.
Is the EPA still working on estimates?
Exxon is actually responsible, is required to do a new site examination and to figure out how much oil is there, which they're still doing now. they're doing that at the same time they're removing the oil from the site. So it is underway. And then the other big news is the environmental benefit money, this $19.5 million. The state and a group of community organization representatives have been working to develop a whole public process for setting up that fund and putting out a request for ideas for projects to use that money for to do environmental projects in the community. And so that's we had big news in the middle of February where the state of New York chose two organizations, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the North Brooklyn Development Corporation, as the organizations that are going to administer this fund, basically. So these two groups working together will come up with a request for proposals and send that out to the community and solicit project ideas. And then they'll hold a couple of public meetings to explain that whole process, to solicit projects, and then to select projects eventually. And so over the next 1 to 2 years, we'll see that process work itself out, and then hopefully we'll have some projects going in the ground definitely within 2 to 3 years, and certainly within 5 years. And so, this really represents an amazing turnaround for this community it's suffered with a lot of industrial pollution and oil pollution over the last 100 years, literally. So we really think we're kind of turned the corner and are heading in the right direction finally with Greenpoint.
An EPA official has said that the area will never be pristine as it once was 500 years ago. What are your hopes of the change that the residents will see in the future?
Well, I agree. Unfortunately, we're never going to get back to what it looked like 500 years ago. But our hope is that they can clean up the creek enough to the degree where we can have some natural function come back, which is basically have some small areas of natural wetlands, small areas natural shoreline, and even when you go out on the creek now, you'll see birds and you'll occasionally see fish there. So there's an effort. If you give nature some space to come back, it will come back and reestablish itself. So I think we're looking at some little areas in the creek where we can restore some wetlands and restore some natural habitat. We can get a full cleanup of the creek, and a big goal of the community is to increase public access to the creek, because we really have a residential community there that enjoys being at the shoreline and enjoys going out in kayaks and canoes and sharing this waterway. And it is an industrial waterway, so we still want to maintain the industrial uses that are there. But it's
and there's also a renewed interest in waterfront properties, and perhaps that's going to help the cleanup.
There is. I think there's some pressure that to clean up from the city and from other local organizations and businesses that would like to see would help their property values to have a cleaner creek. And there's a large residential development in Hunts Point, which is at the mouth of the creek in Long Island City. And so a lot of development going on, but it's a unique area in a lot of ways because there's still this desire to balance the industrial uses. They're very active industrial businesses on Newtown Creek that want to stay there and are operating there. We think we can find a way for them to continue working and for the public also to have access to the creek and enjoy it.
Philip Musegas, thank you for being in studio with us today.
Thank you very much.
When we come back, independent actors and producers leveling the playing field online. finally from us, the number of shows with black actors making up the majority of the cast is on the decline on network television. But many independent producers and directors have found a new outlet to showcase their work, the web.
Abby Ishola filed this report in a budding director, Tony Clomax. He's encouraging other African-American producers and directors to take similar steps as he did.
And in this particular shot, the bar scene, we can't even see you guys.
On any given day, you can find Tony Clomax behind a camera. It's been over 10 years since he left his job as an academic advisor at Northwestern University to pursue his dream of making films. These days, the Chicago native is hard at work on directing his online series titled 12 Steps to Recovery.
I don't know what to do. I wouldn't know what to do.
12 Steps to Recovery, in a nutshell, is healing your heart one step at a time.
If you go out on 12 dates, it'll force you to get out of the house.
And it's a cross between Curb Your Enthusiasm and Sex and the City with some cinnamon and spice. And when I say cinnamon and spice, I'm talking about people of color.
Clomax says showing diversity on screen wasn't his only goal. The idea for the series came after funding for a feature film project fell through due to his lack of experience as a director at the time. Once he wrote the story for 12 Steps to Recovery, the City College Masters of Fine Arts graduate used his own money to start filming. Then he put the show online to showcase his creative abilities.
I tell actors, black actors and filmmakers this all the time. Stop whining about not getting, like, oh, they're not casting people like me, and it's create your own opportunity, you know, and the web allows you to do that.
Many black independent producers and directors have made this move. The web allows them the opportunity to showcase their work on sites like YouTube, Blip TV, and their own personal web addresses. As far as black web series go, there are close to 100, if not more, and they come at a time when black television shows are almost extinct on major networks.
I think that might be changing, but I think part of the problem is that they lost sight of the fact that black people watch television and they buy things, right, which is what advertisers want. And I think they were also chasing kind of upscale urban audiences. If you think of Seinfeld and Friends, that inaugurated a whole wave of shows targeted at kind of upper middle class, upper class people, predominantly white people, right? People who have money.
Whether for crews or equipment, independent internet series creators like Clomax and first-time producer Diana Brown-Smith say money is always an issue. Clomax is currently directing Smith's new online show titled Disciplinary Actions. It's a drama they describe as Law and Order meets workers' union politics.
Are you accusing me of something?
Sonia, you're paid to do a job.
As of this date, I say I've invested close to $5,000.
Wow. On just 2 episodes.
Yes.
Despite the obstacles, Clomax is enjoying some success. 12 Steps to Recovery boasts over 800,000 views on Blip TV, YouTube, Roku, and other outlets. He's also won various awards at film festivals. Clomax is now a member of the Writers Guild, and he's in negotiations to have 12 Steps to Recovery picked up by a cable channel. All this from an opportunity he created for himself. For Independent Sources, Abby Ishola.
Cut. Okay. Perfect.
Episodes 1 through 18 of 12 Steps to Recovery are already available online on bliptv.com.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned.
Until the next time, be independent-minded.